am I ready to go?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I do want to thank you for this opportunity to just share some perspectives on, what I see as the value of our voice in a democracy. And as you go, you'll see this discussion is so important now, as we contemplate some major issues, constitutional issues here in Jamaica. So I usually start with, what's a democracy? We kind of, know it through many different ways. But the reference to Abraham Lincoln's democracy as a rule of the people, for the people, by the people is well known. But this idea has gotten translated into electoral democracy. So as long as the people vote in a free and fair election, then, we have a democracy. And for a long time, I think people have kind of accepted that as sufficient to establish a democratic framework. But I've always felt that we need to really think very carefully about, this concept from its origin, the idea of rule by the people, people power. Now, the Greek expression of that was very much a kind of direct democracy. And over time, the view is that, this is a little unwieldy if you have millions of people in a society. And so the idea that democracy should be, given by the people, the free consent of a people, a system of government that where the authority lies with the people and ruled by the people, the notion of a kind of representative democracy, the idea that we send our representatives to speak for us. And of course, over time, we've seen that idea that the representative speaks for us doesn't quite work. And so increasingly, trends and processes to deepen democracy is now including this idea of direct democracy again, not so much as the way you run a country in all its spheres, but mechanisms that you see a lot in Europe and Sweden and so on, where you see a lot of frequent referenda, going to the people on a regular basis to hear their voice directly. So these are the models that are out there. And I use that broad lens to say our democracy in Jamaica is in trouble. We see it in the trends in voting. You can see the last election was really the lowest ever. You may wonder what happened in 1983, I think it was, where the major opposition party said, listen, I'm not even going to contest the election, because there was accusation at the time that the election was, the voters list was flawed. And so the opposition just didn't go to vote, there was no opposition. So, it was a lot of people felt there's no point voting. So that's what happened. But you could see the trend is downward, and it's really troubling. We're talking about 37% of the voting population voting in the last election. And there are fears that it could be lower in the upcoming elections. Now, back in 2014, there's this Latin American popular public opinion project, LAPOP study, and it's done every 2 years. And it's been tracking democracy, not only in Jamaica, but across the hemisphere. And the idea that our democracy is at risk is true for many countries in Latin America and in the Americas, I should say. And so, and we're seeing now the challenge across the world. But back then, the thinking was, and the analysis was that, the low level of support for the system and the low levels of tolerance that existed at the time suggested our democracy is at risk. So the last one that was done, 2022, pointed to the fact that the support for democracy has really not recovered to the levels recorded a decade ago. So we're still struggling with acceptable levels of democracy, if you like. And as as that analysis drills down to details, and there are lots of details, but one of the details I found striking is the evidence that there's decline in positive civic and civil society engagement. And so, since 2014, I've been kind of tracking this and doing the analysis and talking to groups and saying, hey, we absolutely need to pay attention to this. And so the question that it begs is, well, what can all of us do to improve our democracy? And I think there's a lingering question for many, does our voice really matter? Do our representatives really hear us? And I suggest that the democracy does matter, and that what it does require is active participation of people that goes beyond voting. So I think the idea that if you vote, you participate in the democracy, and that's enough. I think we have to think again about that certainly in our young democracy since 1962, we have done just that. We voted high levels in the 80s, as you saw from the graph, of us went out and we voted, and we've been disappointed at the extent of the representation and its promise to deliver a better Jamaica. And so I think we're now in the conversation that we need more active participation. So when we vote, we have to actively hold our representatives accountable. And so it begs the question, well, how do we participate? And I think it depends on how we see ourselves. Do we see ourselves as owning Jamaica? Are we the owners of the country as opposed to the squatters or tenants? I say that because, these ideas of squatting and tenancy is a very common experience in Jamaica. And what it means is somebody else is in charge, and you're just here for, a moment until, somebody else who owns the land or owns the house or owns the country decides what to do. And I think it's a major mindset for Jamaicans. And I talk a lot about this. We have to see ourselves as owners. And if we see ourselves as owners, then we have the ownership responsibility. And I think when we begin to take ownership and responsibility for Jamaica, we take responsibility for our democracy and to make sure that our democracy is healthy. And I suggest that this responsibility for ownership is about civic responsibility. And I like to think about two concepts of civic responsibility. We're really talking about responsibility of citizens in a democracy when we talk about civic responsibility. At its core, we talk about, when we talk about civic responsibilities in schools, we talk about our national heroes and we do a historical kind of discussion. But I think at the core, we have to talk about this idea that we are responsible in an active way to make our democracy work. And so I use this definition of civic responsibility as the active participation in nation building by informed citizens committed to constructive engagement to achieve the outcomes that we want. It's a mouthful, but I think when we dissect the pieces, we really get a sense that we have to actively participate, and it's not a loose participation with opinions. We need to get informed, and we need to engage in a constructive way to achieve the outcomes that we want. And we've decided as a society what the outcomes we want in very broad terms. It's there in our Vision 2030, for example, and I add there that the outcomes we want now, we've done the 2030 vision many years ago, but we can update that to include constitutional reform. Our government has said we're going to move on. We're going to create a republic. And there's an ongoing conversation about what exactly that means. And it will require the participation of citizens. And so when we talk about participation, then it begs the question, what kind of participation? And I like to think about this participation of citizens in two ways. We have a civic duty, and I think about civic duty as a legal requirement by citizens for good governance, right? And if we think about the idea that you have to abide by the law, that's a legal obligation, because if you don't, we'll have an unruly society. So we can start there, right? You must abide by the law. And part of the law is to pay taxes, right? And we have laws that require us to have jury duty, right? But also these laws require us to report serious crimes, and there, for example, legislation having to do with children that requires you to report child abuse, and if you don't, you can get arrested. So some of these begin to get into obligations we have as human beings. And I like to talk about the last one, caring for others. We have a legal obligation in tort law as a duty to care. And that's an amazing way to think about that obligation we have as citizens in a society, because here is the law really getting close to that biblical obligation to love your neighbor as yourself. And in fact, the legal dialogue in establishing that principle in tort law actually discussed that legal biblical obligation. This is a duty to care, to care for others. You can't, have water spilled in a public space and ignore it and ignore the risk to people who could fall and hurt themselves. That's a duty to care. And the law can hold and will hold you responsible if you did nothing to make sure that there are signs telling people not to go in that pool of water or what have you. So that's very important. I also like to talk about the moral obligation that we have as citizens for good governance. And we have to, for example, register to vote. In some countries, a legal obligation because you have to vote as a requirement by law. In Jamaica, we now have a moral obligation because it's not in law. I suggest we have a moral obligation to participate in our budget. This is our money and how it's spent. I think we have a moral obligation to hold our members of parliament accountable because we put them in office. And I think we have a moral obligation to advocate for change when we see things that we don't like in our society. As owners, we ought to advocate for the change we want in our country. And this obligation, we want this to be a legal obligation to petition our government. The Americans have fundamental right to petition, and that's in law. It's there in the Constitution. We don't. And now I'm suggesting to Jamaicans, we have a moral obligation to participate in constitutional reform and make our voices heard. And in many other areas, of course. Now, I like to talk about this being informed because we have freedom of the press. Jamaica is on top of the world. In fact, in 2015, I think it was, Jamaica led this hemisphere, #1, higher than the US in rankings of freedom of the press, right? And we remain in the top 5 countries across the world, maybe now within the top 10 across the world with respect to rankings of freedom of the press. We have a piece of legislation, Access to Information Act. In some countries, we don't have it. Right here in the Caribbean, there are countries fighting to get this access. We have it. We have tabled in parliaments on a regular basis, on an annual basis, sometimes within the year, Auditor General and Integrity Commission's report. And these reports lay bare breaches of government officials and government departments and so on. So we have access to information. And of course, the internet is full of information. So we have no excuse to be informed. And so I suggest that as we move to changing the Constitution, there are some things that we have to think about with respect to strengthening this right to have a say, to strengthen our voice in how we run our country to ensure good governance. And I start with the preamble because it is the place where we can assert our sovereignty, our ownership of Jamaica, making it very clear that the power and the authority of our government is derived from the people. The idea that is embedded in the American Constitution, we the people, in order to, and that's what the Americans do, in order to do the things we want done. And at the time, they're talking about in order to perfect a union. That was the conversation and the struggle in America. So we, the people of Jamaica, in order to, I suggest, in order to complete this freedom journey that we've been on since 1838, the abolition of slavery. We're trying to break free from a society, a structure, a system that was never set up for the majority of our people. And so that's the conception of the preamble that I suggest we ought to be debating and discussing. And also provisions in the Constitution that will do things like empower citizens with the right to petition Parliament. And as I said, countries like the US and other countries across the world have a right to petition, and Jamaicans don't. I suggest that we can restructure our Senate to make it an elected Senate. Very controversial. Some people feel that we need to continue this appointment, but we've seen that the appointments by with the majority senators appointed by the ruling party simply rubber stamps what takes place in the House of Representatives and doesn't really give us a voice as the people. And so that's a discussion, the strengthening of our local government, that at the local government level, we can actually shape policy and local law. That's, I think, important. And very significantly, the idea of participatory budgeting, that citizens can participate in the budget at the local level. A share of the local government budget can be assigned to citizens in communities, and we sit down and plan. We have problems like crime and other social problems that we want to fix. And we can say in our community, in our constituency, this is how we want to fix it. And this is what we think, this is how we think we should spend that share of the budget that we as citizens have a direct say in, right? That's not filtered by our representatives. So in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to say to you this morning, that our voice matters in our democracy, that we have a responsibility to actively participate in nation building, not simply vote in what I would say is a passive way, because, we vote and leave it up to others. We have to actively participate in the ongoing process of building our democracy. And it's necessary to ensure good governance. I see it as an imperative that we make our voice heard. And so my last slide is really to think about this very powerful statement that came out of the Middle East, actually. The power of the people is, in fact, greater than the people in power. Thank you very much.